So we're going to open up our second day of our Phanem-anon Celebrating Indigenous Women in Leadership Conference. So I will bring up to the stage Professor Dale Turner in the Native American Studies Department over here, and he can introduce our first speaker.
Geez, I'm more nervous introducing someone than I am talking myself. This is indeed a great pleasure, and it's a real honor, first of all, that you're here visiting us, but to also introduce you. Ellen Gabriel comes from Kanehsatà Nation, which is in Turtle Clan, Kanehsatà Mohawk territory. She is many things, but she's known for being an Indigenous human rights activist and artist. Now, Ellen was well known to the public in Canada, internationally as well, but in particular in Canada and Montreal, when she was chosen by the people of the Longhouse and her community, Kanehsatà, to be their spokesperson during the 1990 Oka Crisis, as it was called, to protect the pines from the expansion from a 9-hole golf course to an 18-hole golf course. And some of us are old enough to remember the Oka Crisis, and believe me, that was impressive. And as someone so young to take that responsibility on was really inspiring for a lot of young Indigenous peoples. So for the past 27 years, she has been a human rights advocate for the collective and individual rights of Indigenous peoples, and has worked diligently to sensitize the public, academics, policing authorities, and politicians on the history, culture, and identity of Indigenous peoples. She's made numerous, if not countless, public presentations on Indigenous rights and history, including presentations to parliamentary committees and the National Assembly on legislative amendments affecting the rights of Indigenous peoples in Canada. She has been active at the international level, participating in the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, negotiations on the Nagoya Protocol of the Convention on Biodiversity, and most recently at the UN Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. In 2004, she was elected president of the Quebec Native Women's Association, a position that she held for roughly 6.5 years. In 2005, she received the Golden Eagle Award from the Native Women's Association of Canada. In 2008, the International Women's Day Award from the Barreau de Québec, or the Quebec Bar Association. As well, in August 2008, Ellen was the recipient of the Indigenous Women's Initiative Jingo Sase Woman of Peace Award for her advocacy work. So let's welcome Ellen Gabriel. Okay.
Sego, wat kon warados, kasi tsakwas na yujats tanaw ganyato. Hando ka taswa wakatong zone ji de tinwarado na agwego na gatsas sa oyera. De tinwarado na yate nista unhunta. De tinwarados na izes gwetsunga. Kano wat kon warados na sunggoya tituji oya sawini sarada yingwanagere na gaya te nista unhunta. Tano oni de tinwarados na agwego de tawana. So I greet you in my language. I greet all the natural life cycles that allow us to be here today. I greet you as the people. I greet Mother Earth, and I greet all our relations. I come from a very small community. It's the oldest Kanehsatà community in existence today. It is the first community that accepted Kanehsatà, which is the great law of peace or the great shining peace. And it is a community that is still struggling to get out of what we experienced 27 years ago, which was a military siege of our community for protecting our rights to self-determination. What they actually wanted to do was build luxury condominiums, extend their golf course, and they wanted to remove our ancestors, my ancestors who have been there for multiple generations. They wanted to remove them so that they could extend their parking lot. And so I come from a long line of people who have resisted, just like your people have. And it's a community that is 62 kilometers. I always forget what to do in miles, but it's 62 kilometers northwest of Montreal. And our sister community, Kahnawake, is right near Montreal, and they have the Mercier Bridge. They blocked the Mercier Bridge to defend us so that the army would not be called in, and that the Sûreté de Québec, who are the provincial police, would not come in again. So I come from a long line of Turtle Clan women. We're very proud of who we are and the fact that we are still there, because for over 300 years, the settlers have been trying to remove us from our traditional territory. One of the things that I want to start off about when we're talking about decolonization is we need to know what colonization is, right? A lot of people say, and I heard this from the Truth and Reconciliation, not the Murdered and Missing and Inquiry Commissioners, saying, we don't, white people don't know what we say when we say colonization. And so it's really hard to describe how colonization has impacted us. Because you see that I got here, all right. I drove here. I was able to get an education at Concordia University. I'm able to travel more or less freely. But when I go into the traditional territory, the traditional settlement, which is now called Oka Park, or Parc National d'Oka, I have to prove that I am an Indigenous person before I am allowed in. We have to prove that we are Indigenous people before we're allowed to pick our medicines. And we are still trying to prove that that's our ancestral territory. So the late John Mohawk described colonization as interrupting the patterns of learning to survive and substitutes it for learning to serve. And yesterday we heard wonderful speakers, Mililani and Jennifer, talk about that colonization and how it changes our mind. And Kanehsatà, which is the language of the Kanehsatà people, people of the flint, and you can tell we're stubborn because flint is it's a rock that just start fire with, and that's what we are, those people. And what happens is, in colonization, you are told that everything about you is no good. And you are told by the colonizer that your language is no good, your way of life is no good, and even what they would consider religion, although we don't consider it religion, we consider it more a way of life, your religion is no good. And so everything about you is no good. And when I was growing up, I'm 58 now, so when I was growing up, I was a child when Woodstock was going on. And some of the Montreal papers would show these young women without a top on, and it was like, oh, it's scandalous, right? But me and my sister are looking at the Journal de Montréal, which is a French paper, and we're going like, wow, look at them, like, wow, this is great. But so we have the same cultural references as all of you. We like rock and roll. Mililani, you talked yesterday about the guitars, and we're grateful to the Hawaiian people for giving us these gifts. And so we have the same cultural references. I remember when John F. Kennedy was shot. I was a young child, but I remember seeing his funeral on a black and white TV, and thinking, why isn't Captain Kangaroo on today? Right? I was a child, but I remember that. I remember when Martin Luther King was shot. I was still a child, but I didn't understand why someone would be shot for being a person of color. I still didn't get it. And my parents knew that. My parents knew that, they had to fight for what we had as Indigenous people. And so, in order for colonization to be successful, they had to go to where one of the pillars and one of the strengths of Indigenous people was, and that is the family unit. And who holds the family unit are the women. And so they had to attack the roles of the women, and they had to legislate something that would undermine the roles of the women. Now, a lot of times people will say, like a lot of the priests used to chide the Iroquois men because they said, oh, look at them, they're henpecked because they're taking orders from women. Well, that was just normal. I want to talk to you a bit about our creation story, because it'll explain to you as well where it come from as Indigenous people, as Iroquois people. And I want to talk to you about how women are actually being written out of history, Indigenous women, and that there is a resurgence to bring back what the memories of those women, their contributions. Because we all know the chief with the headdress on. That's who people think of when they think of Indigenous people. When they think of Indigenous art, they think about British Columbia Indigenous people's art. That's why I think we have to go back to those creation stories. And I remember an elder saying, if you don't know your creation stories, then who are you? How can you know about yourself if you don't know about your creation stories? And so the first two human beings on Mother Earth, according to our custom, were women. So we had Sky Woman who came down from a world that some people like to romanticize. Some people like to say, oh, it was a perfect world, nobody went hungry, everybody was happy. But if you look deeper into how the world was, that celestial world was, there was jealousy, there was still fear, there was still hatred. They may not have been hungry, but they have all the things that we have today as human beings. They were transferred down. And when Sky Woman left, and some people will say, well, Sky Woman left, she was kicked out. Her husband kicked her out. But I think she left willingly. Because if we know women, we will only take shit for so long, right? And then we're going to leave. So she left, and she went into this abyss because she saw this world that was full of water. Sound familiar? And so she's leaving, and she's in this abyss. But she grabbed with her strawberries. She grabbed with her some tobacco. And she took with her a sunflower, and that sunflower was able to give her a little bit of light. And as she's traveling through the abyss, she hears a voice talking to her, and that's her elder brother, who she had talked to when he had passed away. He was the first person to die in Skyworld, and she was able to talk to him. And he's talking to her, and he says, don't worry. I'm going to help you through this. I'm going to help get you through this. And right now, that sunflower will help you for now to see the light. But eventually, I will be there to brighten the skies for you. And that's why in Iroquois culture, the sun is our elder brother. And I know for some, it's other Indigenous people, they call him Father Sun. But for us, he is the elder brother. And when she lands, of course, Sky Woman is pregnant. And when she lands on the turtle back, and to make a long story short, it was, some will say a muskrat, some would say it's otter, that was able to put a piece of earth that they found at the bottom on top of the turtle shell. And they say that they were human-like, the people in Skyworld. They were human-like, and they were also godlike. Because we're using colonial terms, but and that's the best way we can translate it to the colonial languages. And so when she landed and she started walking, and the earth started growing, and she started throwing seeds around. And so the first creator on this planet was a woman. She brought all those things that we have a lot of today. And her child was a little girl. And that little girl, she held close, and she nurtured her. And when she became old enough, in our stories, they say that the west wind made her pregnant. He put 2 arrows on her stomach, and she became pregnant with 2 boys. And these 2 boys started arguing they're in the womb. This is the nature of men, right? They're in the womb, and they're already arguing, right? But, for some people, they think it's a very violent way. They think it's, these kids should not hear these stories. But one came out the normal way, and he says, no, this is the good way, and the other one came out through her armpit, and he killed her. And so the grandmother is the one that raised them. So I just want to talk about how the role of women is from the beginning, and how water, we're talking a lot about water these days, the sacredness of water. And yesterday Mililani talked about we're 80% water. And how crazy is this world we're living in that gives more rights to corporations over water than human beings, where it's okay to destroy the water that we can that's drinkable. What, 3% of the world's water is drinkable? So the sacredness of water is in those teachings. And for us, we have a very small drum. It's called a water drum. And they fill it with water, and there's a hole. And that is what we use for our songs. And it's a very sacred way. The deerskin is there, and everything has a symbol and a purpose. How many of you heard of the one dish, one spoon thing, too? So the one dish, one spoon, is really about equality. It's really about that we both have that right to eat from that spoon and share what is ever in that bowl. That we are all the same, that we are all unique, but we all have that right to share in that. And that it says the men and women should be united as one person, one body, one mind, one heart. And what colonization did was divide the people into many minds, into many hearts. And so people are like, I'm right, you're wrong. If you disagree with me, then you're my enemy. That's the kind of things in the politics that we see in our communities. And part of it comes from the colonizers. Now, Bartolomé de las Casas was the one that documented the cannibalism of the Spaniards when they first came to the Americas. How many of you were taught that in your schools? Nobody? Just here.
I feel I have to say that.
Yeah. But this is the kind of history, right? This is the colonial history that has come, and that he, de las Casas had to go and tell the Pope, we can't be eating them. They are human beings. And so he documented a lot of the early goings. And he was one of the sailors that came with Columbus. So he came from the beginning, and he saw these things. And I think at one point I remember seeing an article, and I can't remember who, but they had analyzed the conquistadors. Basically, they were serial killers, right? They killed babies. They had no discrimination in who they killed and how they killed. And Frantz Fanon says colonialism is extremely violent. And that's what colonialism is. It's an extremely violent experience that has been going on and is being perpetuated constantly by colonial laws in order to oppress Indigenous people, in order to convince us that their ways, their languages, and their ways of doing things are much better. That theirs is the only solution to a better life. And so Canada and the US both claim their sovereign rights over our lands, our unceded lands, through those doctrines of superiority. And that's what Canadians are celebrating 150 years this year. I'm not celebrating that. Montreal is celebrating 375 years on our territory. I'm not celebrating that. What I'm celebrating is that we are still here, and that we can still have our languages, our dances, our songs, and we can still know about that traditional knowledge that our ancestors fought so hard for. And as a youth growing up and trying to learn about things, one of my heroes was Geronimo. Geronimo was a fierce fighter. It took them a long time to capture him. And this is, when they did capture him, they patted themselves on the back. And this is part of that genocidal process and history of Canada and the US and indeed in the Americas. And in the Americas, when they started being able to feel more comfortable, the settlers started feeling more comfortable and more at ease with themselves and decided that, you know, we still have an Indian problem. So maybe the solution is to educate, take those children out of their homes, get them away from the influence of their parents, and assimilate them. But really and Duncan Campbell Scott is infamous in Canada in regards to the genocide that he and the first Prime Minister of Canada created, the genocidal policies of Indian residential school, and who knowingly denied medical help to children in the Indian residential school who had tuberculosis and other things, who knowingly gave smallpox disease blankets. My community was one of them where they gave the blankets to our people. They impoverished the people. And I put these two contrasts together. Chief Dan George was also another hero of mine as a teenager. And how many of you knew Chief Dan George? I've heard of Chief Dan George, right? Really nice old man, he was an actor. I think he was in the Little Bighorn. Yeah. But I liked what he had to say. If the legends fall silent, who will teach the children our way? Because that's what it's about. It's about the children. And you are benefiting today being here at Dartmouth because you have the kind of opportunities that previous generations didn't have, that previous generations didn't want their children to have. A lot of my father's mother went to Shingwak Residential School, Indian Residential School. She was born in the late 1800s, and I remember I was 5 years old and I was just gonna go to school. I started day school, and my grandmother said, you know, you're very lucky that you're gonna be coming home, because when I was a child, I wasn't allowed to come home. I had to stay, and she talked about having the horse and buggy and traveling for a long time and not being able to see her parents. So the goal of education really, and this is taken from the US, the policy of education was to dispossess the Indians of their lands. That was the goal of education. It really remains the goal of colonization. It's always been about economics. It's never really been about the good Christian heart who wants to help the noble savage become something better. It's really been about economics, getting something for the crown, the monarchs in Europe. It's really been about that, and it's no different today. Canada is a Commonwealth country. Canada has a queen. And in 1982, when Canada changed its constitution, you see Queen Elizabeth saying, well, I'm the Queen of Canada, ha, ha, ha. And yes, we are finally giving and recognizing Indigenous peoples having rights in Section 35, but the details of what those rights entail, that will come later. And so what Indigenous people have to do in Canada is actually go to the Supreme Court of Canada in order to define what our rights are. And it's ridiculous because it's costly. You have to go exhaust all the other levels of municipal courts and provincial courts. And it's actually, it makes you crazy thinking about the kinds of hoops that Indigenous people have to go through in Canada to define what our rights are. So the government of Canada apologized for the Indian residential school system. And some of the survivors actually rejected it. I was in Parliament when they actually did the apology, and I didn't believe them at all that it was a court-ordered settlement. It didn't come out of the good graciousness of their hearts. It didn't come out because they thought it was the right thing to do. They were being sued. There was a class action suit against the government of Canada. And so it was a court-negotiated settlement. And what happened was there were individuals, you got, I think, $10,000 for for if you were there at least 1 year, and 8,000 for every year that you were there. Now, the stories that we heard from the survivors talk about not being able to speak their language. And we have to remember that these are 5-year-olds going to school, 6-year-olds going to school, not speaking English, not speaking French. The minute they get there, they are separated if they have brothers. They're separated even from their big sisters. And when they start speaking English, they are punished. When they start speaking, when they start speaking their language, they're punished. And some survivors talk about needles being put in their tongues, sometimes their hands held over a hot flame. And in Shinwalk Residential School, where my grandmother and 150 members of my community went to, there is in the basement what is called a dungeon, where they used to tie the children's hands to posts down there, and they would keep them there until they felt that there was sufficient punishment to these children. And those who survived and went home were told that they had to create families, they had to get married, they had to have children. What kind of healing was for them? They didn't get any. They got home, and when they tried to talk to their parents, they didn't recognize them. They didn't speak the same language. And so this is the impact, this is the legacy of the Indian Residential School in Canada, and I know that it's the same in the US. And so when people talk about, well, that was in the past, right? That's the past, this is now, we're going to move ahead. You guys have to learn how to move forward on this. Well, moving forward, what does that mean? Does that mean that we accept the injustices that are happening now? Does that mean we continue to accept the criminalization of the land defenders? People who are trying to stop pipelines, people who are trying to fight the development that's going on in our communities, people who are trying to say the government are a bunch of liars when they talk about implementation of the UN Declaration. And so I found these quotes from the Honorable Rosalie Isabella, who talked about silence in the face of intolerance means the intolerance wins. Indifference is injustice's incubator. And it's not just what you stand for, it's what you stand up for. And we need more than rhetoric of justice, we need justice. On the top of that car that you see, that police car, which the Sûreté de Québec gifted us on July 11th, 1990. They were so scared of us. They left us their cars. They gifted us their cars. They left the keys in there. And so the guys took over, and we never blocked, I'll show you some pictures. We never blocked a highway. We blocked a dirt road, which was on our commons. And so that young man who passed away, I think about 8 years ago, he's from my community, got on top of the car. He was so proud of what we did that he got on top of that car, and I think this picture went worldwide. So we're talking about reconciliation and the act of reconciling when former enemies agreed to an amicable truce. I still don't see a truce in Canada. I still Canada continuing the status quo. And the insidiousness of colonization makes us feel like everything's okay. I can go to the grocery store and I can get the groceries that I need for the week or that day. I can go to the shopping center and buy clothes that I need for that day. But if I try to defend my rights, I will be criminalized. If I try to go where my traditional territory is and try to stop the settlers from going on to make a point, I will be criminalized. And so the government of Canada has not yet enacted any kind of reconciliation in Canada. And one of the things that we need to do in decolonization, as I mentioned before, was to recognize the roles of the women. Now, another thing of when I was growing up is that women's lib was pretty big back then. Women were burning their bras and saying, I'm liberal, I'm liberated, and all these kinds of things. And you know, when you're a kid, you don't quite actually get what's going on. But gender equity is something that is missing in our communities. Gender equity is not just about, okay, I have a right to to pay the bills just like my husband or just like my partner. Gender equity is really about having the same rights as anyone else to be able to be part of a decision-making process. And I understand that men are, we know the anatomy of men and women are very different. So men have more muscle, we have more fat for childbearing, and we're not going to dispute that. But what we are disputing is how women are portrayed, women are thought of. We're living in the era of the Kardashians, where their kind of feminism or feminists' way of looking at things are what the popular culture is looking at. And it's ridiculous because the more people watch it, the more they're giving credence to that kind of ridiculousness. And one of the things that really bothers me about when people in my nation start talking about decolonization, and they start talking about the Great Law of Peace, and they talk about Hiawatha, who helped the Ganawida. The Ganawida had 2 sets of teeth. That's what his name is, the Ganawida. But he had a brilliant mind for peace. He had such wonderful ideas to bring the warring nations together. Peace, love, respect. And all those things take courage. But the first person who accepted his ideas of what peace meant was Jagunsaze, the new face. And Jagunsaze said, I will help you if you will help me promote the corn culture. And our people were living in palisades. And she says, these people, these cannibals, and I will admit that we had cannibalism amongst the Confederacy nations. These cannibalists, the moment we make an agreement, they come back and they violate it. Does that sound familiar? And so Jagunsaze was an important part of promoting the great law of peace. People talk about Hiawatha, and Hiawatha had an important role, but people forget about Jagunsaze. And she is the first clan mother. She is the first clan mother of our people, of the Confederacy, of all those nations who sat under the great tree of peace, the great white pine. And I want to read you a quote because I think it applies to what we're doing today. And it says, you must never disagree. If not, the white panther, the fire dragon of discord, will come and take your rights away. And whoever is left must climb the great tree of peace to escape. If there is no escape, try to find a great elm tree. Find its roots. Go back to the beginning. Go back to those ways that brought our people peace. Otherwise, the children will suffer hardships, and the heads of the Confederacy will roll away. A calamity of poverty or disagreement will befall your children, because children must have security in their home, peace, and happiness. That is what the great law of peace is. That is what we are supposed to be searching for. And I remember when the siege of my community happened, and after a while, after you have that time to think about it, and I'm thinking, why are we going through this? Why is this happening to us now? Because, why didn't our ancestors do something before so that we wouldn't have to be living through this in this time? And I was kind of angry at them. And then when I started to learn and I started listening to the elders, I thought, they did try. It was not for a lack of trying that we were experiencing this kind of indignity. It was not for that. They did try. But because the colonizers were coming from places that they themselves were sick, they themselves had twisted minds when they came here. They couldn't understand us. They didn't want to understand us because their monarchs wouldn't let them, their bosses. And like people like Jacques Cartier and like Columbus, these were not the people who were like the greatest minds of their societies. These were pirates. They raped and they pillaged. This is who their monarchs sent out. And now they are the historical figures that every single child learns about, whether it's in Canada, the US, or any part of the Americas, and in any part of the world when they're studying the history of the Americas. You are praising the actions of pirates, slave drivers, people who today you would not want as your leaders or would not want to have your children learn about who they are. But yet we're insisting on it. And when we're talking about changing the curriculum, we talked about that this morning, changing the curriculum. Well, let's talk about who those people actually were. Let's talk about what motivated them. Because it was not for the good of the church. It was not according to the teachings of Jesus Christ. I don't think so. I'm not a Christian, but I was raised in the United Church. I've read the Bible, I know. I don't think Christ would be very happy if he knew what was going on. This is the road that we blocked. There were 3 injunctions placed against us saying that, well, if an ambulance has to go through it, it won't be able to go through. An ambulance never goes through it. This is the place where, for generations of our people, of our community members, we had picnics, lacrosse games, foot races for the kids. When I was a child, that was all sand. And I remember around the 1980s when people started talking about acid rain, that's when I started seeing grass growing and the pines. And Kanehsatà means the place where the crusty sand dunes lie. The British in the 1600s called it the castle. According to the history of Canada, we are 17th century immigrants. This is not our homeland. And it's not true, because yes, there were people in the Mohawk Valley, but there were also people in Montreal, in the area of Montreal and where I come from. And we put a fishing shack. This is an ice house, ice fishing shack. And people started telling stories, and the people started getting to learn about each other, because after a while, when you become colonized, you become very individualistic. And when I was a child, it was like, the ladies would have a bazaar, we would have a rummage sale, that's how we got our clothes. And people, and it didn't matter if she was related to you, if an elder told you, stop that, sit down, and be quiet, you did it. And today it's like, you don't tell my child what to do, right? And that's how far we've come from those times of tradition. So this is some of the things that we experienced in 1990. We were not allowed free passage of food, medicine, or family members, and so we organized things to try and get them to agree. There were fighter planes, there were tanks with cannons on it. And Kahnawake had the inconvenienced motorists. And that was the only thing that the government of Canada and Quebec were outraged about. They were concerned about their constituents, their future constituents that to come into the next election with such victory, to say that they had handled the Mohawks properly. And every night, gangs of racists would burn effigies of Kanaka people. So I want to mention to Kalai that I really meant what I said when I said I'm not a Canadian citizen. Kalai, I almost gave Kalai a heart attack yesterday when I was filling out the form, and as this form, I said, I'm not a Canadian citizen. And it was the first time that people in Canada heard that, and they said, what are you talking about? You're not a Canadian citizen. Where were you born? Of course you're a Canadian citizen. Well, we don't accept imposed citizenship. A lot of our people, even in the US, don't accept imposed citizenship. I forgot to bring my Confederacy passport. I traveled a few times on my Confederacy passport, but when you're a woman and you're alone and you're traveling to countries like Japan or Mexico, it's kind of scary. It's even trying coming back into Canada, I had a hard time. because the government of Canada didn't recognize my passport. So there's certain things that someone said, pick your battles. So one of the things, the frameworks of reconciliation, which is not a perfect document, but it is a document that I think Indigenous peoples should be proud of. It took a long time to get to, as Mililani said, 22 years. But it doesn't create new rights. The UN Declaration is comprised of different kinds of international human rights instruments that you see on the board. And part of those rights include language rights. I work at the Kanehsatà, which is a language and cultural resource center. And for a long time, I created curriculum for the immersion school. I used to teach art to kids, and I would teach them what clay was, the different things that we were making for that day, give them those vocabulary words, because a lot of kids didn't hear, like me, when they went home. They didn't hear Kanehsatà when they went home. And so for me, one of the big fights is our language rights, our cultural rights. But I want to emphasize these things, that there are not new rights that have been created for Indigenous people. We always had those rights. The Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which was created after World War II to try and stop the outrageous inhumanity against each other, did not include Indigenous people, did not think of Indigenous people at that time, but now we do. And the fact that we do not get money from the taxpayers, it is a trust fund that was created in 1886. And that trust fund is controlled by the Canadian government. But the propaganda against us is like, okay, there's going to be $3 billion, for example, for Indigenous people. 67% of that budget will go to the bureaucracy of Indian and Northern Affairs Canada. And the rest will trickle down. And of that trickling down, there is an Aboriginal industry. So you have the research councils, who will take X million dollars. This year, Canada announced an increase for Indigenous languages. 64 million will go to the National Archives in Canada, because we need to record these languages that are dying. There's only 3 languages in Canada that are expected to survive to the end of this century. So that's Inuktitut, Cree, and Anishinaabe. So while there's a lot of efforts in the 7 Kanehsatà communities to revive our language and perpetuate our language, that's another thing, is the perpetuation of those languages. In order to perpetuate a language, it needs to be lived. You need to feel it. You need to live that spirit of that language. But people are thinking, well, we'll just record it, right? Future generations can hear it. But that's not enough. It's not enough. So I wanted to put this, since I'm in the US, I rarely get to do this, because in Canada, yes, we watch the US and what's going on. Canadians are actually Northern Americans, really, when you think about it, because we watch your TV, we look at everything that you do, everything that comes out of your president's mouth. We cheered when Obama won. We cried when Trump won. But I wanted to talk about Trump's hero, which is Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson, he's touted as, and again, it goes back to this pirate-like people. He enjoyed killing Indigenous people. He enjoyed the oppression of Indigenous people. And your current president, his hero is this man. This man who had some of the blackest deeds in American history against Indigenous people. He did the Indian Removal Act. And he thinks that the president, it doesn't matter what Congress or anyone else says, the president has that right to interpret your laws and constitution. And I just want to say, how many of you felt overwhelmingly disappointed and fearful when they heard that Trump won? Yeah. Welcome to our world. This is what we have been living through all this time since the colonizers established their Indian Acts. This is what we have been living through. This kind of person who says half-truths, who says that you're the liar. You don't know what you're talking. You're just a stupid Indian. You're just a dirty Indian. What do you know? We're the ones that know. I'm the one who knows better than you. That's what we've been living through. So when you think about Trump and you try to understand what colonization is, what it's done to us, just think of Donald Trump. One of Canada is trying to say that the Indian residential school wasn't that bad. It was cultural genocide. It wasn't actually genocide. But genocide is genocide. You take an identifiable group of people who have a land mass, they have a government, they have a language, they have a culture, and you forcibly take their children from them. That is genocide. There are over 3,000 unmarked graves in old Indian residential schools across Canada today, and they're still finding more bodies of children that were killed. That's genocide. I don't know if Canadians feel better saying cultural genocide. I don't know if that helps them in their guilt, but it is genocide. So if we're switching, and I think one of the biggest things that gets ignored besides language when it comes to people's self-determination, and we're talking about decolonization, is food sovereignty. So food sovereignty, we have, as I said, the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, which nutritionists discovered maybe 15, 20 years ago, that when they're eaten together, they make a complete protein. So in the times when our people were not able to hunt the deer or whatever, they still had the three sisters to help them and provide them with the protein intake. But with climate change, and those of you who live in the city don't see this, but those of us who live in the country and have gardens and still practice those agricultural ways of our ancestors, our planting times are getting shorter. They're starting later. So people are planting their seeds in their homes. You might not even get the yield that you need. There are farmers who grow what they call cow corn. So there's a lot of, I think Canada still has Terminator seeds. They have GMOs, and we have insects that are able to survive the winters now, because the winters get cold, the winters get warm, there's freezing rain, it warms up a little bit, and then it gets cold again. And that's really destroying everything that makes up our culture. And then when we go and examine pipelines, well, pipelines, when they damage the environment, they're not just damaging the water, they're damaging the whole environment. You will not be able to grow your plants there. You will not be able to eat the animals that drink from that water because they are so riddled with cancer. So food sovereignty is a big issue. And someone asked this morning about what is the greatest priority that we have. I say everything. We don't just have one priority, it's everything is a priority. Because if you are not able to enjoy part of your human rights, if one part of your human rights is gone, then you can't enjoy the rest of your human rights. So think of it when your body. So think of it when you're sick, you have a toothache, you have something wrong, you have a cut, you sprain your leg, you can't enjoy, right? You're not enjoying your existence in your body, the body that we borrow for a little while. Think of a paper cut. It's a tiny little thing, right? Tiny little thing, but it's annoying and it hurts. So think of your human rights in that way, that if you are not able to enjoy access to your language or rights to your language, you're not able to enjoy food sovereignty. If you're not able to have good health, if you're not able to have the kind of education you need to survive in this world, if you don't have security in your home, but you have your health, then your mental health is affected. And that's why you need to look at human rights in a holistic way. It's not just one right that trumps the other. It's all those rights. And that's what Indigenous people believed from the beginning. So the real and potential uses of the Declaration, the UN is really, I don't know, the UN is kind of like that place where you're on a carpet and someone's going to pull it out from under you, right? Oh, it's a beautiful carpet. Wow, look at the colors, And the states are just kind of like, yeah, enjoy your time on it because we're going to pull it out from you. They did it to us on the Convention on Biodiversity. It's a terrible, terrible piece of legislation. The convention, the Nagoya Protocol, is the most terrible convention for Indigenous peoples in regards to genetic resources and traditional knowledge. But we have to use the tools that we have, right? It's kind of that clunker that's going down the highway, but it's getting you from point A to point B. Well, if you change the motor in it, it'll run faster. Give it a nice paint job, it'll look better. Well, the Declaration is kind of like that, in the sense that for Indigenous peoples, it was a major victory, and I want to thank people like Mililani who worked on this document with many other people, because I'm sure it was very difficult to convince states that this was even a possibility. And the Declaration should not be, you should not interpret the Declaration article by article. You should interpret the Declaration as a whole, along with your customary laws, along with your customary traditions. For us, it's the great law of peace. We have a constitution that pre-exists European arrival. It helps fill in those gaps that the Declaration has. And the Government of Canada talks about the Declaration in regards to Section 35, which recognizes the rights of Indigenous people, Aboriginal people's rights. They call us Aboriginal. And they say now it's a full box of rights. But to me, it's still an empty box because the government is really resisting. It's like that cat you want to put in the cage, right? That cat's holding on to those sides and saying, no, I'm not going in that. Well, this is what we're up against. And this is why you as the youth, the leaders of tomorrow, need to be aware of the kinds of things that is happening on the world stage. And if you look at the UN, they're mostly men that you see who are the leaders. And the Indigenous women have fought really hard to be where they are today. The Indigenous women have talked about things like violence against Indigenous women. And at the beginning, I remember when the discussions were going on about murdered and missing Indigenous women, the head of the Assembly of First Nations at that time said, well, we're not going to cherry pick our rights. We're not going to cherry pick our discussions, what we're going to talk about. That's a woman's issue. Well, who is hitting the women? It's a man's issue. And that's why I'm happy to see all the men in this room, because you have to be those role models for those young boys, for those youth, to be able to convince them that hitting is not part of our culture. Hitting, domestic violence happens everywhere. It doesn't discriminate on class, it doesn't discriminate on race, it doesn't even discriminate on gender. But it's an issue that people are not talking about. They're not trying to address it because they know, because a lot of us know someone who has lived through that. I've lived through that. Everybody has a story to tell about violence of some sort. But the issue of murdered and missing Indigenous women, as Amnesty International and the Native Women's Association of Canada stated, is rooted in colonization. It's rooted in colonialism because the Indian Act was designed to attack the role of the women, to diminish who we are as human beings. And trying to undo that is an extraordinarily big challenge. And so for now, we are able to get and raise this issue to the point where probably many of you are now aware of it. I'm not sure how many of you are aware of the Amnesty International in the US, the Maze of Justice. Talking about the jurisdictional issues, the ridiculous issues. How many of you are aware of the Maze of Justice? Not many. So the Maze of Justice is really about the fact that if a white man came and he raped someone on the reserve, if the tribal police couldn't catch him before he got to the edge of the reserve, that guy was scot-free because it became a federal jurisdiction. And so they were not able to prosecute a lot of the rapists. And so the Maze of Justice tried to address that, and I think President Obama passed a bill where this was not going to be happening anymore. The other thing about being an activist, and it's part of the Iroquois Confederacy's sayings, is you have to have skin 7 spans thick from your thumb to your, I'm guessing it's this finger, but they say the main finger, so that a knife could not penetrate it. Maybe it's this finger, who knows? Irregardless, having skin 7 spans thick helps you to be more tolerant, helps you to be more patient. Because when you're doing this kind of work, people will attack you. It's not just, okay, I'm out there, I know my rights, I know what I'm doing, we're all together. People will try and bring you down. People will try to say that, you're just a troublemaker, you just like to complain. But really what you're doing is standing up for those future generations. It's about the face is not yet born. That's what we're doing it for today. So when people start attacking you, just remember, it's not about you. It's about those faces not yet born. So the nature of human rights are indivisible, inalienable, universal, interdependent, about equality and non-discrimination, participation and inclusion, accountability, and the rule of law. How many people really understand the rule of law? How many of you are lawyers? Nobody? Nobody took any law classes? Human rights classes? So the rule of law is basically this, that you have these norms, these customs, and whoever gets in power doesn't make an arbitrary interpretation of that. But that's what's happened for Indigenous people. I posted a lot of slides that talk about international human rights, and this is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to action. But I want to say that reconciliation is just a ruse. I don't know what it's going to take to actually make significant changes in Canada, to make significant changes in the US. Some of you talked about this morning that the non-Indigenous students don't get it. You can have people suiciding, you can have people who are living in extreme forms of poverty. You can have a natural disaster and people start donating, people start giving. People talk about, when a child goes missing, oh, isn't that terrible? But really, society is living in a broken system. A system that allows pigs like Trump to become elected because he has the money. It allows people who are tyrants and despots to become prime ministers, to become elected leaders in the UN, to become even our leaders. Because we are all so busy trying to survive. We are also busy trying to just keep our heads down, not get in trouble, not have any acts of violence against us, not being able to feel secure. And I wonder what it's going to take. Because 27 years ago, I thought about if I was living around this time, surely there would have to be significant changes. Surely Canada would change. Surely something would come about from all the suffering that our ancestors have lived through. But we continue to put up leaders who think that resource development should be taken advantage of, that we should benefit economically from it and allow it to come through our communities because it'll help the poverty. Well, poverty is rooted in colonialism. Poverty is exactly what the colonizers want us to live in. And poverty is really going to be the big issue for a lot of our communities for a long time to come. People commit suicide because of poverty. People commit suicide because they're different. A lot of our children leave our communities because they are homosexuals, transgender. And yet when that child is born, we say, oh, look at the beautiful baby that is born. Look at the beautiful light that is around that baby. But we have conditional love. No matter what we say about we love them unconditionally, they love us unconditionally. We put conditions on them, on how they are going to live their lives. And it's different from if a child has an addiction problem. It's different when it's like that. But when it's about their choice of life, we put a criteria on it. And that's where I think that we are living in a broken system. We are living in a time when the terrorists are calling us terrorists. We're living in times when our interpretation of sovereignty doesn't jive with the colonizers. They talk about self-government. And self-government is really just about municipalizing. I don't know if it's the same wording in the US, municipal. In Canada, it's municipalities. So you have a town. You have a town like Hanover, Lebanon. They have laws, they have bylaws. And so that's the interpretation that Canada wants us to have. They want to have they want us to totally get rid of their fiduciary responsibility. And I'm really for that. If Canada wants to give up its fiduciary responsibility, that's fine. Then give us back our land. Give us back access and control to our resources. Give us access and control over our education. Stop contaminating our waters that we depend on. In my culture, it's the women that are title holders to the land, and the government of Canada will never respect that. They will always use the band councils. Now, the band councils are imposed systems of governance that replace the Indian agent. I don't vote in those elections. I don't vote because I don't believe that system is for us. It's for the colonizer, for them to find the brown-skinned people to implement their policies and their laws, and to continue the aboriginal industry that is there. In honor of women, this is the great thing about networking with unions, networking with civil society organizations, is they are the constituents of the politicians. And if they create something, the politicians actually listen. They will actually do something about the problem. And so the Canadian Union of Postal Workers created this beautiful poster to raise an awareness of the murdered and missing Indigenous women. And now we have a murdered and missing Indigenous women inquiry. Last May, the government announced that it would have a commission of inquiry. In June, they announced who the commissioners were. In September, the commissioners started establishing their office. They started buying computers, photocopiers, file folders. I don't know what else. In February, I went to one of the consultations that they did. It was not an official consultation, but the year before that, I had gone to a pre-inquiry where they talked about using Indigenous laws to protect Indigenous women and children. And when I went to the one in February, the commissioner said, "We're starting with a blank page. We don't know where to start. You tell us what to do." And I said, "What about the pre-inquiry? What about that pre-inquiry where you had family members telling you, this is what we want, this is what we'd like to see you do, this is what we want the police to do." And what's happening is that now the family members have to register online, retell their testimonials to the Commission of Inquiry. And this Commission of Inquiry really doesn't have a lot of teeth. It can't tell the police what to do. It can make recommendations. But the police don't have to honor that. It can tell the government it needs to do this, but the government doesn't have to do that. So it's a crazy world we're living in. And a lot of people say, we need to reset the button on this. We need to start over. And I think that there should be an international independent inquiry, both in Canada and the US, on the issue of murdered and missing Indigenous women. Because we will not find the answers, and the government of Canada will not find the solution, because it benefits them to keep Indigenous women under this. So I'm just going to end with this slide, because it is the voices of women that really have made changes in Canada. From the issue of status, when a woman, I'm going to say, I'm going to start using our language because I don't want to use too much of the colonizers' language because it's totally inadequate. But women went to the UN and they said Canada practiced discriminatory laws because when they married a white man or whoever who was not Indigenous, they had to leave the communities that they grew up in. They weren't even allowed to be buried. I remember Mary Tuax Early, who was from Ganawagin, who was a pioneer of the Indigenous women's movement in the 1970s. She created Indian rights for Indian women. She says, the ridiculousness of the Indian Act is that I can't be buried in the community that I grew up in, but a dog can be buried in the community that I grew up in. And if we're going to decolonize, we need to decolonize ourselves. If we're going to have reconciliation, we need to have reconciliation for ourselves, which starts with us. We're not going to get it from the colonizer. We're not going to get it through laws or legislations. It's got to come from Indigenous peoples themselves to realize the ridiculous behavior of our people in casting out our people just because of who they loved, because of who they are or were. And to bring back those stories of those women, like Jagunsaze, to raise her level of recognition in our history, equal to that of the Ganawida and Ayawata. Because we're never gonna, even the way we talk, you know, our founding fathers, you don't think that women were there? The democracy of the Confederacy would not be a democracy if the women were not there. It is the women who declare war. They have a war chief who works for them. It is the women who are title holders to the land. It is the women who pass on the languages and the culture. It is the women who nurture the children. They change their dirty diapers. They hug the children when they're hurt. It's the important role of the women, and it's not to say that the role of the men are not important, because we could not do it without the men. But we want the men to step up to the plate, to say that violence is not part of our culture. You know, being in love can be crazy making, right? People have all kinds of a range of emotions, and that's normal. And we need to teach our children about being in love. Because one of the things that were attacked by colonization was our love and our sexuality. People forget about that because it's an uncomfortable thing to talk about, our sexuality. Because really, that should be behind closed doors, right? But that's why we're here, you know? Those hormones were rising in our parents, and they made us, right? So we need to start bringing back, in Akwesasne, they're bringing back the rites of passage for boys and girls. But I know that the young women need help because they think that if their boyfriend beats them, and I know this recently from one of my cousin's daughters, her boyfriend beat her, and her friends were saying, you cannot make a complaint against him. He loves you. That's how he shows his love. The girl is 17. So we still have a lot of work to do in regards to decolonizing our family unit. It starts from the beginning. Because justice, what does that mean? It's just a word. It's really about that mind, having that good mind, that peaceful mind. You know, that voyage you take from your head to your heart. It's really about remembering the past so that you can go forward in the future without having to explain yourself. I think that's what we do as Indigenous people. We have to explain ourselves a lot. We wouldn't have to do it if the education system was actually successful. So I thank you for inviting me. I thank you, Kalai and Maikai for having me, and to Dartmouth for keeping me here as long as you have. It's been a very enriching experience, and to Jennifer and Mililani and to Winona. It's a great honor to be on this speakers list with you. I guess the only thing I can say is Skana. Peace.
Okay, guys, so we're going to go ahead and open up the floor for questions, Q&A. I'll be running around with the mic if you have any questions. Yeah. Is this one on? Okay.
Okay.
I'll get my notice.
Hi, thanks so much for your wonderful talk today. I just have two quick questions. One is, what type of advice would you give to perhaps other communities? As you know, across northern Canada, there's a lot more pressure these days to open up land to fracking and to other unconventional extraction. Do you have any advice for communities that are going through these pressures to sort of open up their lands or feed their children, kind of, you know, that demand, like we need jobs kind of thing? And then my second question is, in a lot of communities too, institutionalized religion still has a really important power on a lot of people, and a lot of communities aren't talking about that. You know, the state has its role, but the role of the church is still really rooted in a lot of communities, and plays into the whole gender and other community issues. So I was just wondering if you had any comments about those two factors. Thank you.
I don't know if I really have advice for them other than to reflect and see how it's development has impacted other communities who are living it firsthand, and to see if that's what you want for your future. I think just like the international community is talking about sustainable energy and sustainable development, and that's where we should be. I always encourage Canadians to write their member of parliament to make sure that they're pushing for the greener, I don't even know that's right. Greener energy, sustainable energy. I know in the north it's a big problem. Garbage is a problem. There's lots of toxic waste up in the north because they think that people can't see in the north. In my community, we have an old, it's called the St. Lawrence Columbian mine. And when I was growing up, they were dynamiting. And we found out recently that in our well water, because we all have well water still, there's uranium. We have uranium in our water. They're coming back to try and mine uranium again. And niobium. Niobium is one of the rare metals that it reinforces steel for tanks. So it's used as war. It's supposed to be used in pipelines. It's really about taking a step back. Don't rush. Actually practice free, prior, and informed consent, and you have the right to say no. You don't have to always consent. And your other question was? There's religion wars, I think. I think that goes back to the mind that's turned upside down. And maybe you should ask the ones who are Christian, what would Jesus do? Not, I don't know. I don't know. It's really hard because we all experience it in our communities, and it's really, one of the bane of our existence is those religious wars. But I say to people, okay, so you think that our ancestors are rotting in hell because they weren't Christians when the settlers first came? So you got to think about our ancestors. If we cherish and love the roles and what they passed on to us, because we practice those songs, those ceremonies, those dances, you have a right to choose Christianity, but you also have to respect other people's choices. And I know that in, I think it was Ojibwe, somebody put up a sweat, and the council got so many complaints, they were told to take down the sweat. Those are part of the religious wars that have no place, and it should be part of decolonizing and teaching decolonization.
Is this working? Can you hear me?
Hi.
So, one thing's always, there's a lot of things that have perplexed me, but one of them is, like you talked about the reconciliation, right? And I feel like, so in, a couple things. One is that in Australia, Mill talked about it yesterday, but they had that, they, apologize for the stolen, for stealing all those kids, yeah? And then they have this day in New Zealand, in Australia, that's called National Sorry Day, right? Which I think is super funny. Yeah. It's like the day that I don't really get that. It's like National Sorry Day for that, right? But they didn't really change anything. They just have like National Sorry Day.
Yeah.
Right? And so then I look at, of course we can't get any apology here, right? But so then in Canada, they had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and Harper was, of course, super evil through all that. And now you got like Trudeau in there, but like some things changed, but a lot of things didn't change, and so I don't know, is it, I guess what I'm saying is like, how do we get justice in that process? And I know, like I have relatives that were residential school survivors, and they like had to count how many times they were beat, and they had to document it, and you got more money for a number of times you were beat, and like what the heck, So what is do you have an idea on a process, or like, I don't know. I was just like, that's always kind of bothered me, like, because none of them seem to neither of those fix it.
No. Right?
And I don't know how things get fixed, but maybe that's, obviously first step is acknowledge you did something wrong. So I just was curious about that.
Yeah, in the Truth and Reconciliation process, there was no reconciliation. There was a lot of truth-telling. And one of the negotiated agreements said that they could not prosecute any of the abusers who were still living. And if they named one, they would go into in-camera sessions. That was Stephen Harper's condition. With this new government, it's not that new, they pretend that Canada is on the road to reconciliation when they're actually just perpetuating the status quo. They're not changing things. They're telling the people in their press conferences, and they did it at the Permanent Forum last year and this year, oh, we're on the road to reconciliation. We intend to fully implement the declaration. But they are liars. And so I think the only way is actually for the people to do it themselves and to to put pressure on their MPs, to put pressure on the UN, if that's possible. Because lands, resources, education, health, culture, language, all these things are still being pressure cooked, right? And if we use colonial laws, we'll lose. There's been some really good decisions at the Supreme Court of Canada, but they narrowly define what our rights are. And I think it's really thinking outside the box of talking to the people and being able to educate the people. You know, short of going to war, which is add to the problem, I think we really need to have the youth help us, like, as you know, like I typewritten my papers and wrote them out. This younger generation is able to use social media in a way that we were never able to have. We didn't have those things. They're going to be the ones to make change. There's going to be like a generation that needs to go before we make those changes. And I think we can still hope for justice. I don't think reconciliation is the right word, but if we had a timeline of when we saw that justice happening, and I'm wondering if it's actually within my lifetime, or if it's when these young people are our age, because they're pushing. We need to keep pushing back. Just like all the movements that have happened. Like a revolution really needs to happen. That's what has to happen.
You know, I mean, just to ask, but, you know, so, like, I always wondered, you know, I think it wasn't Warren Lyons, it might have been Warren, who just, you know, always used to say the only compensation for land is land. Or a lot of our sorry, you know, elders have said that, right? And so you look at that, so you say you're sorry, but everything is still structurally the same. And I was like, what does justice look like? I feel like, you know, I want to say this is what justice looks like. Like John Mohawk's quote at the beginning. Like that's what I feel about these corporations. They're interrupting my perfect life that creators need. You know, I want my perfect life back. You know, I mean, and I always wonder because there's so many, you know, great intellectuals in Canada in that dialogue. I feel like you guys are ahead of it, you know, because we already had a process. But I don't know, like, have you done any, you know, like, what does justice look like? I don't know. Y'all understand what I'm saying? Yes.
I think you have more challenges here on this side because the way that Indigenous organizations are structured in Canada, it's national, right? So something happens in Canada, it goes to all the communities and social media, and you get to see, like you're right, there's great intellectuals in Canada, but there's great intellectuals in the US. Justice, and I'll refer to something Mililani says and refer to something which is in Ahantukariwatekwa, which is you speak for those who do not have a voice. That's what justice is. That's what bringing about change is about. And you know, when we start a meeting, we talk about the water. We thank the water, the spirit of the water. We thank the insects. We thank the green plants. We thank the fruits. We thank everything, you know, like the thunderers. The thunderers they have that UV, they capture the UV and then they toss it down in their light. It's going back to those things to help us understand what those relationships are about. And I think we should be assimilating the settlers. That's what justice would look like, us assimilating the settlers into that peaceful way. It's not a perfect way. I wouldn't say it's perfect because nothing is perfect. But assimilating them, their children. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? For your presentation. I really appreciate it, Ellen. You know, in terms of the implementation of human rights, there's a layer one, because I'm on the Navajo Nation Human Rights Commission, and I hear my own people complain about the complicity of our leaders. For example, there's never ever a collective one presentation or one action in terms of, say, to energy development. There's some of our leaders who are pro-fracking, for
Yeah.
example. And so we get a lot of criticism because our work is intended first to implement human rights, advocate for it in relation to the United States' assertion and claims of our domestic dependent relationship. Okay? And then on the other hand, the complaint is that how can you hold the U.S. to a standard of human rights when our own leaders don't have that standard for their own people and their own land? And so I just, it's really difficult in terms of thinking about how do you deal with these layers of implementation. First, to advocate for your own leaders to begin the implementation of human rights as their standard, like free, prior, informed consent. At the same time, you're insisting and demanding that the U.S. as a settler nation be held to those standards as well.
Yeah. Well, we have to stop putting people into positions of leadership based on popularity contests. We should have a criteria of what we want our leaders to be. There should be training of youth to become future leaders. There should be a training program for children, for youth. We shouldn't just be trying to hit the minimum standards. We should always be going for higher standards than the minimum standards. And using human rights along with those kinds of traditions that respect everything. Because some traditions, maybe some traditions need to go, and I'll just kind of make a generalization on that, but some traditions, they're there because they strengthen the people, like the medicines. We understand that, the medicines are part of that biodiversity, and those of you who are in the sciences, you know that frogs are an indicator species, right? And if they go, you know that your environment is also going. So we're agricultural people, and I think you guys are as well, right? The Navajo Nation and others, and Hawaii. And if we think that our rights are separate from the environment, then we are sorely mistaken. Our human rights should go be meshed in with environmental rights. For our relations that we always mention in Holland. We should step out of that colonized box that says human rights over here, environmental rights over here, and so on. It's all one. In the Longhouse, the spiritual and political bodies are intertwined. When we do something politically, we do a ceremony before we do it, so that we have the right minds when we're going out to do that work. And I think that's what we really need to examine. How are we doing these things? What are the processes that we're doing? And how can we educate future leaders and nurture them? Not just put them out on their own and say, okay, let's see how you fly, but actually nurture them and be with them side by side as they're going along.
We have time for one more question. Okay. Well, let's give her another round of applause for Ellen.